All right. So good evening again to everyone. So this evening's workshop is all about the FAFSA, which is the free application for federal student aid. I have a PowerPoint that we're going to follow along with, but Jess, I almost said your name. Grace is going to drop a link in the chat to a workbook. The workbook has a lot of additional detail beyond what you will see on the slide deck. And if you at some point would like a physical copy, please reach out to us and we'd be happy to work with you to get you one in some way, shape, or form. So I'm going to dive in because we've got a lot to cover this evening. So I'm going to first just walk us through our objectives for tonight. The first thing we're going to do is go through all of the terms that are associated with this process. So there is no shortage of acronyms and jargon associated with the FAFSA. It oftentimes feels like alphabet soup. And so we're just going to kind of talk about what all these things are, what they mean, so that when you hear them, you know them. We're then going to talk more specifically about what the FAFSA is, why it's important, when to fill it out, and how to get started. We will also be sure to talk about using the correct website because there are some folks out there who will prey on students and families and try to get you to pay to do the FAFSA. That's not what we want you to do. We'll go through the form itself and just look at some potential pitfalls and how to address personal circumstances. We're then going to talk about the FAFSA submission summary and understand what that is, why it's important, and what to look for on it. We'll talk briefly about two different forms of professional judgment reviews, and then we will also touch on what information to have on hand when you sit down to fill out the FAFSA, as well as just taking a quick look at dependency statuses and dependency questions on the FAFSA. So we're going to go ahead and get started with the terms. So the first term is FAFSA itself. So the FAFSA is the free application for federal student aid. I really want to emphasize that first F. It is a free application. So please do not ever pay anyone to do the FAFSA for you or pay a website to help you with it. So it is really, though, the most critical part of the financial aid process. The FAFSA is a math calculation. So it uses information that the student and their family put onto the form to calculate something called a student aid index, or the SAI, which we'll talk more about in just a moment. And that student aid index is going to determine a student's financial aid eligibility, in particular, federal and state grants, federal work study, and student loans. All eligible students really should file the FAFSA, and that would include U.S. citizens as well as eligible non-citizens. And those are primarily those who have legal permanent residence or a green card. Students who might not be eligible to file the FAFSA would be encouraged to contact the Scholarship Foundation for assistance in exploring other financial options. So our next term is the Federal Student Aid ID. So this is a username and password. It is quite possible you have already created an FSA ID, and the FSA ID is ultimately used to access any number of federal student aid processes. So it would include the FAFSA. It's also going to serve as your legally binding signature, an electronic signature on the FAFSA, as well as on other things related to the Department of Education. So it's really important to have an FSA ID and to be the one responsible for creating your own federal student aid ID. So although it is just a username and password, and my guess is you have dozens of them that you use on a daily basis, because the federal student aid ID is largely connected to Social Security numbers, they're very important to keep safe and secure. Starting later in December, some individuals without a Social Security number will be able to create a federal student aid ID as well, but that process has not launched yet. It will open with the launch of the 24-25 FAFSA. Students, every single student who files the FAFSA has to have a federal student aid ID. For many students, they will need at least one parent, potentially two parents, to have an ID as well. So the next term is the SAI, and this stands for Student Aid Index. So again, this is the output of a processed FAFSA, and this number is used to determine a student's financial aid eligibility. So I have told multiple people this year that this is probably the hill I'm going to die on. So federal student aid, the Department of Education define the student aid index as a student's approximate financial resources to contribute toward their education for one school year. But they are adamant that it is not a dollar amount. But I am going to encourage you to treat it as a dollar amount, because the way in which it is used to determine financial need, it is used in a calculation with dollar amounts. All of the rest of the factors are a dollar amount. And so in my head, that means this is treated as a dollar amount as well. So I just want you to have that context. The student aid index can be a negative number. So the lowest possible SAI is negative 1,500, but aid is awarded based on zero essentially being the lowest. So students whose SAI are between negative 1,500 and zero do not necessarily receive more aid than a student who has a zero SAI. Our next term is the FAFSA submission summary, and we'll look at this in greater detail towards the end. But this is basically the summary output document of a FAFSA form. It's going to provide a variety of different details and data, including all of the data that you input onto the FAFSA. And the reason why we want you to know what it is, why it exists, is because there are a number of scholarship organizations, including the Scholarship Foundation of St. Louis, that ask for information or copies of this document as part of our application processes. And so we want you to recognize that it's there and available and may be necessary for applications for other sources of financial assistance. So our next term is contributor. All of these terms are federal student aids terms, not necessarily mine or the Scholarship Foundation's. And so everybody on a FAFSA, student and their parent or parents, or potentially a spouse, is called a contributor. So this is, again, any individual who's required to provide information on a FAFSA. So all contributors give consent and approval using their federal student aid ID for federal tax information form. So we'll talk more about federal tax information and how this is all going to work as we get further into the presentation. All contributors have to have a federal student aid ID. Again, it's going to serve as a legally binding signature on the FAFSA, and it's also going to be what allows an individual to provide approval for their federal tax information to be used on a FAFSA for consideration, for the student to have consideration for financial aid eligibility. It does not require anybody to pay for the student's education, nor does it require them to borrow for the student's education, but it is an absolute necessity for them to be eligible for aid consideration. And all contributors have to provide approval regardless of their tax filing status. So our next term is FTI. This is federal tax information. So this is a pretty straightforward one, but I just want you to know, if you see FTI, what they're talking about is federal tax information. And really it includes any information from a tax return or other data that is going to be received from the IRS by the Department of Education as part of financial aid consideration. There are so many terms, right? Like lots of alphabet soup going on here. So we're almost through them, I promise. Our next term is FAFSA FTI approval. So again, this is that federal tax information. And this is really just the formal approval that is given by the student and their contributors, so their parent, parents, or spouse, to the Department of Education in a given FAFSA application cycle, for the Department of Education to take that federal tax information to determine an applicant's financial aid eligibility. So just be aware of that. And if a contributor, the student or a parent or parents or spouse who are required do not provide consent or approval for FTI to be used, the student is not eligible for federal financial aid. Our last term is Title IV. And so Title IV really is any federal financial aid that is used for post-secondary education. So this would include federal grants, federal work study, and student loans. So Title IV really just refers to the federal legislation that governs the use of these funds. Okay, so you've heard me say free application for federal student aid. You've probably heard the FAFSA talked about just way too much this year, given the changes and the delays. But what actually is it? So the FAFSA is an application, it is a form, it is an algorithm. So when you file the FAFSA, there is no one else on the other end that is looking at all of the data that you've input and carefully evaluating that information to determine a student's aid eligibility. The computer is crunching those numbers. It is looking at students' income and assets if they have them, the income and assets of the parent or parents or spouse, as well as the number of people in the household. And it's taking all of that information and calculating the student aid index. So it's really just, it's a form, it's an algorithm, and that's what it is. So if you have ever heard somebody say the FAFSA is paying for college, that's not necessarily true, because the FAFSA is really just an application. The FAFSA is so critically important to file. It is really the gateway to paying for college. So without a FAFSA on file, you cannot be considered for any federal aid. In the state of Missouri, you cannot be considered for really any aid. You do have to also have a FAFSA on file for A+ funding. And at a lot of colleges, the FAFSA is used to determine eligibility for institutional aid as well. So it is, for many students, the most important financial aid form they will fill out each year. And so it's critical to file the application. So this has been like the biggest question of the year in my world. When do I file the FAFSA? So federal student aid has said that the FAFSA will open by December 31st, 2023 for the 2024-25 financial aid year or school year. So we would tell you to file the FAFSA as soon as possible after it opens. In future years, this means that you want to do the FAFSA as soon after October 1st as possible. So the December 31st date is just for this year. Next year, I want you to be thinking about October 1st, because you do have to file the FAFSA each and every year. Coming back to this year, the state of Missouri is still using a priority deadline of February 1st. It is possible to receive consideration for state aid after February 1st, but to be guaranteed consideration, February 1st is the date that you want to use. Many colleges also have their own institutional deadlines, and as best I can tell from the research I've done, there are not a lot of schools that have pushed back their institutional deadlines either. So a lot of students may be working with a pretty narrow window to get in and do their FAFSA and have it submitted by priority deadline. So if you don't already know the priority deadline of the for the FAFSA of the institutions that you or your student are considering, I would highly recommend doing that research in the next few weeks, just to make sure that you're working off of the earliest possible deadline that you may need to use. So how do you begin? So we're going to look at the FAFSA website in just a moment here. The first step is really to create that federal student aid ID. And I know Grace has probably dropped that link in the chat for the workbook. There are pages towards the back. I think it's like, maybe Grace, you can double check and then drop that in the chat. It's towards the end of the workbook. There's some information about getting that FSA ID. And that FSA ID is really where you're going to begin. You want to have those verified by the Social Security Administration and ready to use before you sit down to do the FAFSA. So we would recommend doing them at least 5 days before you plan to submit the FAFSA. So again, we're not expecting the FAFSA opening for another few weeks. And so you have that time to potentially work on creating those IDs if you haven't already between now and the end of December. So all of the images that we're about to look at are draft images. Federal student aid is still making minor modifications, as far as we understand, to the website and the form itself for 24-25. So please just recognize that anything that you see here this evening is likely going to look a little bit different when you actually sit down to do the FAFSA. But the image that we're looking at right now is what we expect the landing page of the studentaid.gov website to look like when the FAFSA goes live in a few weeks. And you'll see in the top right-hand corner, there's a little red circle. I've highlighted where it says log in or create account, because we want to be sure that you know where to go in to create your federal student aid ID, or where to go to log in when you get to the website. So Students are really encouraged to be the one who starts the FAFSA, and we'll talk about how this is all going to work as we go through this, but it really ought to be the student who starts the FAFSA. So once the student has their verified federal student aid ID, they're going to log in with that username and password on studentaid.gov's website. You'll see that the form is going to welcome them and ask whether or not you're the student or the parent. And so depending on your role, you're going to indicate that here. We're indicating student at this moment. And then once we've indicated that, we're going to see a couple screens that are essentially, I think Federal Student Aid called them an onboarding process, but it's essentially some FAQs giving you some overview information about what to expect. So the first part of this process is just explaining to you what the FAFSA form is. There's a little video. And the second part of this is giving you more information about contributors. So who contributors are and how to invite those individuals to fill out the FAFSA. And then the third and fourth parts of understanding the FAFSA are what to expect. So they're giving you an estimate of how long it may take. Their estimate is about an hour. And then they're also going to provide some information about what to expect after submitting the FAFSA form. So I do, I'm trying to decide where to get into some of these details. So you'll see here on the image that says 4 of 4 that they talk about that FAFSA submission summary. There will be some delays to receiving those early in January. And so we'll talk about the importance of keeping track of your confirmation page and email when we get to that part. So on this page, I just want to highlight in the on the bottom where the red circle is again, where it says account settings, you'll see that all of these identifiers that the student has already entered are not editable on this page. So the only way that the student or a parent, if it was the parent identity information, can change any of these details is if they go to the account settings. So if there's a name change or a contact information change or something is mistyped initially, you would need to go to account settings to make those corrections or changes. So we're going to go through some of these slides a little faster than others. This is permanent mailing address and state of legal residence. And immediately or very quickly, the student is going to be asked to provide consent for their federal tax information. So I want to take a little bit longer here to just highlight a few things. So the first is that we know for sure the language on this page will be different when the FAFSA opens in a few weeks. So just know for sure this will look different. The second thing is that that green summary box is probably going to be the most important stuff to read and understand. So I would encourage you to read all of it because it is a federal form. You are making some significant agreements by using your FSA ID here, but the green box is going to be the most important components that they want you to understand and take away. And then they do also have some FAQs here again about providing consent and the implications of providing consent. A reminder that anyone who declines approval or consent for federal tax information to be used, that does mean the student is ineligible for federal financial aid. So we would hope that folks will approve it so that the student is in the best position to be considered for the financial aid dollars that they may be eligible to receive. All right, so the student is then going to be asked about their personal circumstances, and the personal circumstances are really determining whether or not the student needs a contributor, and if so, who that contributor may be. So they're going to be asked about their marital status, and then they're going to be asked about their college and career plans. One note here, so our recommendation is students who are graduating from high school, but who are graduating with some kind of dual enrollment or other credits that they've earned while in high school should still indicate that they're going to be a first-year student. We want your students to get maximum consideration for financial aid, and so it's important to indicate that. The school may make adjustments later, but we want them to be considered for those opportunities for first-year students that the school may have. And then there's going to be this big checklist of questions. So these are the dependency questions that by and large determine whether or not a student is required to provide parent information on the FAFSA. The vast majority of high school seniors do, but there are students that we work with each and every year for a variety of reasons who are considered independent or who are unable to obtain parent information. And so we'll take a look at that in just a moment. So if a student indicated that none of these apply, and then if they also indicated that they did not have other circumstances pertaining to being homeless or at risk of being homeless, then they are likely considered to be dependent, and they're going to be required to have parent information of some kind. If a student indicates yes to one of these things, just one, they would be considered independent and would not need to provide parent information on the FAFSA. So on the next page here, you'll see that it talks about student unusual circumstances. So again, I just want to emphasize this is federal student aids language, not the scholarship foundations. So these are personal circumstances that would prevent the student from being able to obtain parent information. So you'll see on the screen that they've given some examples of what these personal circumstances might be. If the student's left home due to an abusive or neglectful environment, perhaps they've lived with another family member for much of their life, but there's no court documentation of that guardianship. So we would refer to that as an informal guardianship, or other students who maybe do not have access or contact information for their parents. These students may have personal circumstances that would allow them to go through what's called a dependency override, and they're going to be treated as what's called a provisionally independent student. So they will be allowed to submit the FAFSA without any contributor information, but they will need to contact the financial aid office at the school or schools that they're considering in order to verify the documentation or to provide documentation to verify their circumstances. However, for many of you on the call, potentially, there will be this information that says the student is dependent. And so they're going to assume that there's going to be information for one or more parents on the student's FAFSA. Now, you'll see here that it does give the student the ability to apply for a direct unsubsidized loan only. So this is really only for students whose parents are unwilling to provide information on the FAFSA, and the student does not have personal circumstances that would allow them to go through a dependency override. So these students can apply only for an unsubsidized loan. And so that option is available, but it is one of the it is the loan that accrues interest from the beginning, and so it's going to cost the student more to borrow that loan than it may some other options that could be available to them if they have the information from their parent or parents that is required. All right, so the student is then going to be asked to provide some information about their parents. I think federal student aid is calling this the parent wizard. And so I know there will be more questions on this, but how the student answers these initial questions will help the form guide the student to determine which parent needs to be included. Do both parents need to be included as well? And so at that point, the student will be given the ability to invite their parent or parents to the form as contributors. So it is going to be really important. I imagine that a lot of the folks on the call are going to be those parent contributors. And so I would highly recommend that although we would encourage your student to be the one who sits down to start the FAFSA, that you be sitting with them when they do this if possible, and in particular, be present for their documentation of this information on this page, because the information that they enter here has to match exactly what you've used to create your federal student aid ID. So if I'm doing this at school by myself as a student and I mistype my parent's social security number or use my birth date instead of theirs, which trust me happens all the time, creating federal student aid IDs or entering things on the FAFSA, you, the parent, are not going to be able to see that invitation because it's not matching up with your federal student aid ID. So it's going to be really important for all of the data here to match exactly what you've used to create your own federal student aid ID. And those invitations go immediately from what we understand. So if you were sitting right next to your student and had another device, you should see that invitation come almost instantaneously and be able to log in and start your portion as the parent. This is what we understand. We haven't actually seen it live yet, so just know that. All right, so the student is then going to be asked to enter some information about their demographics. The student is the only one who will see these questions or the answers to them. The information is furthermore only shared with the federal government. None of these questions are, or the answers are conveyed to the prospective colleges or the state organizations like the Missouri Department of Higher Education and Workforce Development. So the form is going to ask about the student's gender. I do want to note that the question regarding whether or not a student is transgender has been removed. And then they're going to ask about students' race and ethnicity. So those details are, these are the primary demographic questions that are not going to be communicated to the colleges or the state agencies. They're going to ask about the student's eligibility based on their citizenship status. So are they a citizen or an eligible non-citizen? Really, students who are not either a citizen or an eligible non-citizen really should not be filing the FAFSA. There's going to be a question about parent education status. And then there's a question about whether or not the student has experienced the loss of a parent in the line of duty. And this is regarding Pell Grant eligibility. They're going to ask about the student's high school completion status. And then they're going to ask the student to enter the high school that they will or have graduated from. So they will have to search for their high school, first by state and then by entering information about city and high school name. I believe this is supposed to be a field that as you type, it will start searching for it. But again, we haven't seen it actually live yet, but that's my understanding. Okay, so we're getting close to the end of the student section. So the student will have to answer some questions about finances. The bulk of the questions that the student might have otherwise answered are going to be transferred through this direct data exchange from the IRS to the Department of Education or federal student aid. So there will be some questions that the student has to answer. These two on this page ask about college grant or scholarship dollars that are reported as income to the IRS. This only refers to students who are continuing college students or who are renewing their FAFSA. This would not be true for first-time applicants. And then there's a question about foreign earned income exclusion, which I think is likely not applicable to the average high school senior or current college student. Now, the student will be prompted potentially to answer some questions about assets. And so there's just a few things to note here. So if the parent contributors have not submitted their portion yet, all students will see the asset questions. However, parents, when you go through and do your portion, and we'll see what those slides look like in just a little bit. If you go through and do your portion and the FAFSA determines that the student, as a result of income and household size, is exempt from reporting assets, the form will essentially pull these numbers out of the calculation that it does. So just be aware of it. Some students may be asked to answer these questions, but ultimately not have them factor into their aid consideration. So you'll see that it asks about the total balance of cash savings and checking, as well as the net worth of businesses and the net worth of investments. In my experience, the vast majority of high school seniors do not have much in the way of net worth of businesses or investments in their name. All right, so the student will then be asked to list the colleges that they would like to receive the FAFSA. So students can list up to 20 schools on the form. You can search by school name or by school code. I think most students search by school name. They select the state and then search by city and school name to list those schools. So this is what the search process will look like. Once you've selected a college, it will show up on a list. You can move those schools up or down on the list. In the state of Missouri, you do have to list a Missouri college to be considered for Missouri aid, but it does not matter the placement on the list of where that college goes. Furthermore, if you listed 20 schools on here, those schools cannot see the other 19 institutions that have been listed. They only know that they've been listed on the student's FAFSA. All right, so at that point, the student is almost finished. They're going to see this summary page where they can expand the sections and take a look at the answers they provided for each section and question. They're going to see information about the contributors that they have shared their FAFSA with. So the names, the date that that request was sent, as well as the status. So potentially if the parent contributor has already gotten in and started it, it may say started or drafted. If they've gotten in and already submitted it, it will say that it has been submitted. And then the student is going to sign and complete their portion. So again, this to read this and understand what they're agreeing to when they submit the FAFSA. And then they're saying the student section is complete. So again, they're going to go back to those parent contributors so you can see that information. And then the student is going to see some information about what to do next or what they can expect to happen next. So we're going to pivot next to what's going to happen from the parent contributor role. So parent or parents, you will receive an email that looks something like this. It will say your student can't be eligible for federal financial aid without your input and information. You've been invited as a contributor. Again, you will see that it says that it does not make you financially responsible, but it does allow the student to be considered for a variety of financial aid options. I want to highlight, so the left image, there's bold text towards the bottom and it says forms are deleted after 45 days of inactivity. So this is actually not new. It's always been true that forms are deleted after a while, and it's really hard to be a student to have done your whole portion and then have to redo it because the rest of it didn't get submitted in time. We will work with students to make sure that they can try to keep their forms active, but it will be especially important for any contributor to try to get in and help get their portion complete so that the whole thing can be submitted and not have anybody have to duplicate their work. I imagine parent contributors, your portions would also be deleted after 45 days if you started and the student didn't get in and do their portion as well. So we just wanted to highlight that 45 days of inactivity. So a lot of what we're going to see for the parents is going to look pretty similar. So you're going to log in with your federal student aid ID. If you have an existing relationship with federal student aid, if you already have an FSA ID, you do not need a new one. Again, because they're attached to your social security number, you really can only have one. When you log in, if you have an existing relationship with federal student aid, you may see additional details about those other aspects of your relationship with them. And then you'll have the ability to review your identity information. Again, you have to go to account settings to edit any of these details. There are some parent onboarding screens, but I don't think I have those details for you in the PowerPoint. So address information. And then again, very quickly, you're going to be asked to give your consent for federal tax information to be shared with federal student aid, for the student to be considered for federal financial aid and other aid that may be available to them. Again, we expect that this will for sure look different when the FAFSA opens on December 31st. I know it's not especially big text here on the screen, so not easy to read. And again, that green summary box at the top is going to be one of the most important pieces to read and understand. So parent contributors do have to answer some demographic questions. They're going to ask about marital status. So they are asking about your current marital status, not necessarily your marital status to your students' other biological parents. So in the event that both biological parents are divorced and the parent filling out the FAFSA is remarried, the step parent is likely going to be required on the FAFSA. So there's more details here about parents' current marital status, and there will be help text on the form itself if you've got any questions about that. You will also see that one of the marital status options is unmarried, but both legal parents living together. So in the event that the student lives with both biological parents, but they've never been married, the FAFSA will treat that as a marriage in the sense that like both parents' information will be required on the FAFSA. So then you're going to move into the finance piece of the FAFSA for you. Again, a lot of that tax information is going to sort of happen in the background between the IRS and federal student aid. You will be asked whether or not you received any of these federal benefits or anyone in your household received any of these federal benefits in either 2022 or 2023. It's important to note this. So if you or anyone in your household did receive any of this, this is one way in which students and families would be exempt from reporting assets. So this includes a variety of different benefits, including Medicaid, SNAP, TANF, and free or reduced lunch. Now, they are going to ask parent contributors whether or not the tax return they filed in 2022, if it was a joint return with their current spouse. So, in the event that a parent was married to one individual in 2022 and is married to a different individual now, there is going to be a way for this information to be teased out. I don't know if the direct data exchange from the IRS will be possible in that circumstances, but they are working to make sure that they're pulling all of the correct information onto a student's FAFSA. And so they're asking some of these questions to be sure they've got those details correct. The number of exemptions that are claimed on the tax return that's being used, so this will be 2022 for the 24-25 FAFSA, is going to determine the student's family size. However, if your family size has changed since 2022, this is the place where you would update that. So it's going to ask you if your family size is different, and then it's going to give you the ability to enter that information. And it will also ask you about the number of people in the household who are going to be in college. So I want to just pause here because I don't know anything about the folks who are on this call. So if you have older students, or if you've heard about this, this is a source of a lot of angst for students and families who are familiar with this change. Historically, the FAFSA has taken into consideration the number of dependents enrolled in college as part of the calculation that it does. This year, that is not going to be the case. So what that means is, if you have multiple children in college enrolled simultaneously, it may be that under the old guidance, you were eligible for more aid than you will be under the new guidelines. So I say all that because I think there's a couple important takeaways. So the first is that, yes, the FAFSA is still asking you this question, even though they're not going to do anything with that information. The second is that there are some colleges that may be in a position to take this information into consideration. And so if you are in a household where you already have an older student enrolled in college and you've got another one going, or you have multiples who are going simultaneously, I would highly recommend reaching out to your prospective institutions to ask them whether or not they have any ability to take a look at this in particular. And although the Scholarship Foundation is still finalizing our plans, we do believe that we will be taking this information into consideration as part of our application. So I just wanted you to be aware of that. And if you've got concerns about this, I've got some other thoughts that I'd be happy to share later one-on-one. There will be some additional questions about tax return information, so they will ask you that information here. And this is one reason why we recommend that you still have copies of tax returns on hand when you sit down to do the FAFSA. And then, if required, you will be asked to provide information about your assets. So, child support received is an asset. You will also be asked to report the balance of cash, savings, and checking accounts as of the day that you file the FAFSA. And you will also be asked to report the net worth of businesses and investments. So a few things. So the first is retirement accounts are excluded, not to be reported as investments. So 401ks, 403bs, non-education IRAs, pensions, all of those things should not be reported on the FAFSA. Neither is the value of the home you live in. Those are not reportable assets. However, if you own other property besides the home that you live in, the net worth of that property is reportable as an asset. And if you own any small businesses or family farms, the net worth of those are also reportable as assets. And so if those circumstances are true for you, it might be wise to work on getting that information prepared between now and when the FAFSA opens at the end of December. So we actually had a conversation about this at the office today. So I believe that um, this is just entering the other parent's information. It is possible that they may then have to be a contributor. So the circumstances in which a student would need to have two parents serve as contributors really boils down to a combination of marital status and tax filing status. So the primary times that the student will need to have two parents as contributors would be if the parents are married but filed their taxes separately, or if their parents are unmarried but living together, because again, they would have filed their taxes separately, or if the parent has had a change in marital status. So if the parent was unmarried in 2022 and filed their taxes head of household perhaps, but has since remarried and step parents information is going to be required, then both bio parent and step parent would need to serve as contributors on the FAFSA, and they would both need to have FSA IDs because they're going to need to provide that consent and approval for federal tax information independent of one another. But the FAFSA has always asked for the demographic information of both parents in a two-parent headed household. And I don't think we've actually talked yet about how to determine. We talked about the parent wizard a little bit, but the student is going to request the parent who provides more than 50% of their financial support serve as the contributor. And so that's in the case of parents who are divorced or separated or were never married. In the event that parents are married, both parents will be required to have their information reported on the FAFSA. So at that point, the parent is going to see their contributor sections. Again, they're going to have the ability to review that information, make any necessary edits, and then they're going to sign and complete their sections. So again, legally binding signature, verifying that the information is true and accurate to the best of their knowledge. And then the FAFSA is complete. The student is going to receive a confirmation email. The confirmation email that they receive is going to be very important potentially this year. So I imagine that the folks who are here on this call, you're ready to get in and get this done as soon as it opens. There are going to be some additional delays after the FAFSA opens to receiving the FAFSA submission summary, which we're going to take a look at in just a moment. And so I would highly recommend that before you close out that FAFSA page, locate the student's confirmation email, make sure you have that, and then set that aside, save it digitally or a hard copy in the event that you need to reference it before you get the FAFSA submission summary to know what your student aid index is, or in case somebody asks for it as part of a scholarship application. The confirmation email should have the student aid index in it. Again, this is going to be the confirmation email that goes to the student, not the confirmation email that goes to the parent contributor or contributors. So the next piece of this, again, is the FAFSA submission summary. The earliest that we expect these to be available for students to review is the end of January. So there are a couple things, though, that we want you to see on this web page and to know what to look for. So the circle on the left-hand side here shows the date that the application was received and the date that the application was processed. Generally speaking, it takes anywhere from 2 to 4 days for the FAFSA to process. And so typically a FAFSA submission summary would not be available until the application has been processed. There's just going to be some additional lag time this year for that first month. Now, the circle on the right-hand side says viewing submission number 1. And so what that means is the first time I go in and do my FAFSA, that's submission number 1. If I go in and I make corrections, I add a college, or I realize that I, mistyped something, or my school sees that I made an error and they go in and make a correction, that's going to make a new submission. And so when you are asked to retrieve a copy of the FAFSA submission summary, you always want to get information for the most recent submission or the highest number that you see. But the FAFSA submission summary is going to tell you a lot of really important information. So if you are eligible for a federal Pell Grant, it is going to give you that information, and it's going to give you an estimate of how much you may be eligible to receive. It is also at the bottom of the page going to give you an estimate of your student aid index. So again, this is going to be the number that is going to determine eligibility for federal aid, for a lot of state aid, and at many colleges, institutional aid as well. The student, so if I didn't say it already, I will say it now. The student is the only one who can access the FAFSA submission summary. Parent contributors do not have access to it. So the student can see the FAFSA form answers for all sections of the FAFSA. They can then also see some important details about the schools that they've listed on the FAFSA. So graduation rate, retention rate, the median debt upon completion, average annual cost. So none of these are data points that should be used by themselves to make a decision about where to go to school, but they are an important thing to take into consideration as part of additional information as you are making that decision. And then the final page of the FAFSA submission summary is next steps. And so our understanding is that this page will show any action that is required. So in the event that they've identified an error that needs to be addressed, that information would be here. And if the student has been selected for a process called verification, that information would also be listed here. And so verification is essentially where the student and their parent or parents have to provide additional documentation to the college to verify that the information is correct. So you would look for that information on this next steps page. Okay, so there are two kinds of professional judgment reviews that I just want to share a little bit more information about. So the first is special circumstances. Special circumstances would be a request for, sorry, I'm going to take a drink of water real quick. So special circumstances would be a request for the college to take a look at additional financial information. So again, we're using 2022 tax information when we sit down to do this FAFSA. That was a while ago. A lot has changed for many of us in the intervening year. And so you might want the college to take into consideration new information that has to go through the prospective school or schools. It could be that you have exceptional circumstances that just weren't asked about on the FAFSA that you'd also like them to take into consideration. I apologize, y'all. Not reflected on the FAFSA, that would also be where you would do that. And then unusual circumstances, again, federal student aids language is really about those personal circumstances for the student if they're unable to obtain parent information. So if they're looking to do a dependency override and be treated as an independent student, that would also go through a professional judgment review process. So we have this information in the workbook. We also have it in a different list on our website. But by and large, this is the information we would suggest you have with you when you sit down to fill out the FAFSA. I recognize it's probably pretty small on the screen, but it's going to include student social security name, legal name, social security number, legal name, and birth date, the same information for their parent contributor or contributors, FSA IDs, copies of tax returns, as well as W-2s and 1099s potentially. These are those dependency questions. So I find it helpful to have them written in a way that is a little easier to understand sometimes and to go through quickly. And so there's a list at the back of the workbook as well. And that is so much information, but that is actually everything in the workbook. We have a team of student advisors. So Grace and I are here tonight. Our colleagues Ricky and Dominisha are at the office delivering the same workshop to a group of folks in person. We are, as a team, available to help in whatever way we can. So if this was helpful, but maybe still overwhelming, because I know sometimes it can be, if you'd like assistance with filling out the FAFSA, we would love to do what we can to support you in completing the form or navigating other parts of the financial aid process. So we have some FAFSA clinics that are going to take place in January. I think there's one on Saturday, January 6th, and a second on Tuesday, January 16th. These are in person and by appointment only. And so if you are interested in receiving one one-on-one help, either completing the FAFSA or reviewing it for correctness, we would be more than happy to do that with you. If those dates or times don't work for you, or you would really prefer in Zoom, to do it over Zoom, that is certainly a possibility as well. And you can reach out to any member of our advising team to schedule a one-on-one appointment as well. And so then I've got just our contact information, and those details so that you can reach out to us as an organization. I do want to take just a quick minute, because we've got just a few minutes left, to share with you a little bit more about the Scholarship Foundation in case you are unfamiliar with us as an organization. We are a nonprofit organization that believes that a healthy democracy requires an educated society. And so to that end, we work to ensure that doors are open to members of our community to access post-secondary education. So in addition to workshops like this or the advising services that we offer, the Scholarship Foundation's history is rooted first and foremost in providing dollars to students to help them cover the cost of their education. So we are funding 528 students this year, I believe, with over $5 million in scholarship grants and interest-free, fee-free student loans. And so if at some point you would like to learn more about our programs, discuss eligibility, or consider applying, we would be more than happy to do that as well. So that was a whirlwind. Grace, are there questions in the chat that would be helpful to bring into this space?
I think we only had one question, which was a good clarification. Somebody asked if the FSA ID was just the username and password, or if it referred to like a set of numbers that federal student aid would give you. So just to clarify, the FSA ID is just the username and password. There's no other unique number or anything that's assigned to you that's included in that FSA ID.
Yeah, thanks.
We did have a question just come through that says if it's already been noted on the CSS and that supporting documentation is already into IDOC, does it still need to be put on the FAFSA if not doing any non-CSS schools? And that means the considerations.
So whoever asked that question, if I don't answer it, like if I'm not answering the right question, feel free to clarify. So CSS and FAFSA are entirely separate. So if a student has applied to a school that requires the CSS profile, they can and should do that because it will maximize their institutional aid, but it has no bearing on federal or state aid. And so it does have to be complete. With reference to IDOC, and maybe that's where the question is, that is probably, sorry, I'm like not talking everything that I'm thinking. So if you're asking about IDOC and verification, that is probably a good institutional question. So if you've uploaded documents to IDOC as part of the CSS profile, I do not know if they would consider or use those same documents for verification. And the primary reason why is because verification is really a federal process. Even though the schools operate that process, the federal government is the one who dictates what is a document that is that can be used. And so it's possible that whatever is required may not be have been uploaded into IDOC already. I'm hoping I answered the question, but if not, feel free to reach back out.
We did have a couple more questions come through. So one says, if you have a trans child who has had a legal name change but hasn't legally changed their gender marker, what do you suggest them checking?
Yeah, so that's a question that I generally don't want to tell somebody what they should put as their gender on a form like this. So if they no longer have the selective service question, and that is historically that is the reason why they asked students if they were male or female, is because all male students then had to verify that they were not that they were eligible, that they had registered for the selective service. So I think I would encourage a student to reflect the gender that they identify with, and not necessarily one that does not align with their identity.
And then next question, if parents are married and filed jointly, do they both need an FSA ID?
No, however, Um, I've been doing this work for so long, and the FSA IDs are such a pain. And it may just be wise to both create an ID because you just never know. um, we've encountered any number of random things that prevent somebody from using their federal student aid ID unexpectedly. And so it might just be good to have everybody set up with one, and hopefully only one parent ultimately needs to use it, but it might save some back end stress to just do it all up front and be ready in the event that it's needed.
Another question, if parents are deceased and grandparents are the legal guardians.
Great question. So if it is court ordered legal guardianship, then the student is automatically independent and would not have any parent contributors. The FAFSA is very clear. Federal student aid is very clear. Only biological or adoptive parents should be reported on the FAFSA. So legal guardians are never to be reported as contributors on a student's FAFSA. These are great questions.
To circle back to the IDOC question,
Yeah.
the clarification was if they already have the info, would there be any reason to duplicate that to the government since the school already has it in the case of only applying to CSS schools?
Um, so I think if we're talking about like actually filling out the FAFSA, the answer is yes. You can make a choice for yourself after, so everybody who files the FAFSA and who is a citizen or an eligible non-citizen is probably eligible for something as a result of filing the FAFSA. Not everybody is eligible for the same forms of financial aid and the same amount of financial aid. But even again, getting access to federal student loans in the student or the parent's name, or access to private loans is likely going to require having a FAFSA on file. So if it's a question about having the FAFSA filed, I would say yes. And if you determine that it's not worth it to do it in subsequent years, that is certainly a personal decision to make, and you may not do it in the future. And so I think that may be the question that's asked. If it's about providing like tax documents to the college as part of a verification process, that I think has to be a question of the individual college because they may have slightly different processes for that.
It sounds like the question is related to documentation. So I'm going to drop our contact information so
Okay.
that person can follow up with a further question. But
Okay.
one more did come through on the student asset section. Do they still fill that out, or is it required, even though it will not? Excuse me, even though it will clear or not be considered after the parent contributor adds their assets.
So again, it will be considered for some students. It won't be for all students. They do have to fill it out if they enter it. And in good conscience, we can't tell you not to enter the information if students have it to report. Um, the way that we understand this from federal student aid, and this feels honestly, it feels very cumbersome, and so I just want to acknowledge that, is that their recommendation is that students fill out their portion. Students start their portion of the FAFSA first and invite the parent contributor or contributors. But that doesn't mean that they have to submit their portion first. So what you could do is the student could go in and do their initial portion, invite parent or parent contributors, and then pause. And then parent contributors could go in and do their whole portion so that the student would at least know whether or not they have to answer those asset questions. Because if the parents have submitted their portion, at that point, if the student sees the asset questions, they are required to report them. It is going to be considered as part of the SAI calculation. If they don't see the asset questions, it means the student has been exempted from reporting assets, and they're not going to need to report that. So that is one way to approach it. But if a student sees the questions, regardless of whether their parent has submitted the portion of the FAFSA for the student or not, they really do need to answer those questions, and they need to answer them to reflect whatever is true as of the day they submit their portion of the FAFSA.
Great. Well, I think that was all the questions we had in the chat.
Okay. Well, that brings us right to 7 o'clock. I want to just say how much I appreciate you all being here this evening and express my gratitude to you for sticking with us through an hour of conversation about the FAFSA. In all sincerity, if there's anything that our team can do to assist you as you go through these next steps, please do not hesitate to reach out and let us know. We are more than happy to do what we can to support you. So we will hang out for a little bit.